Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. First things first, quick update on what's been going on with Eddie. So I'm sure if you're listening to this video, you all know who Eddie is. Incompetent Camera Minion Eddie, best friend I ever had, currently in hospital, diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer. Now, in order to deal with the situation, the first thing that they need to do was to install a bypass into his gut to get past the tumour so that he can actually feed himself, long before they even think about putting him on a course of chemotherapy and trying to shrink the tumour down to a size where they can operate on it. So they book him in for surgery, and of course there's a chance that anytime you go under general anaesthetic you might not wake up from it, but there's an even bigger chance that you might not wake up from it if the contents of your stomach are full, because you could vomit that up and asphyxiate on it and blah blah blah. So basically anytime you're going in for surgery under general anaesthetic, you're what they call nil by mouth, I think for at least 12 hours beforehand, which means that you can't eat anything. So they book him in for surgery the next day and he's not allowed to eat anything. And then he wakes up the next morning, ready to go in for surgery. Surgery gets cancelled because more immediate cases come in, you know, people who are going to die that day if they don't get surgery. And I mean, Eddie's going to die, but he's not going to die that day. So he gets bumped off the priority list and the surgery gets cancelled. This happens at least 5 days in a row. I think maybe 6, possibly even 7. And remember, every time they book him in for surgery, he's not allowed to eat anything. But there are a couple of hours each day where he is actually allowed to eat something before, you know, getting the surgery cancelled again the next day. Unfortunately, on one of the occasions when they're intubating him, I'm sorry, for those of you who don't speak English, putting a tube down his throat because they need to keep draining all this crap out of his stomach that's laced with cancer cells. One day when they're putting this tube down his throat, they do it a bit amateurishly, and they end up scraping and damaging the back of his esophagus, which means that anytime anything goes down his throat, it's now triggering his gag reflex and he's just instantly throwing it back up again. So for at least 5, possibly as many as 7 days in a row, he's not allowed to eat anything before going into surgery, and on those few occasions when he is actually allowed to eat something, he's now just throwing it up again instantly. All of which means the only way they can get any actual nutrients into his system and have them stay there is to put him on a glucose intravenous drip. So they're feeding him through a tube. Needless to say, his strength is declining rapidly, but they finally get him in for surgery and it doesn't get cancelled. So remember, this surgery is to put a bypass into his stomach so that he can start taking care of and feeding himself. He can be discharged from the hospital, go home and be treated as an outpatient for the actual stomach cancer. So they send him in for this surgery and he comes out of general anaesthetic to find out that he has been through surgery, but they didn't install the bypass. You know, the thing that they put him into surgery for, they didn't do. And as of this moment, I do not know why they didn't do it. But it can't be good news. So right now that's all I can tell you, because that's all I know. Yeah, it reminds me of the old joke, well, it's not much of a joke, about the difference between the British socialist healthcare system and the American capitalist healthcare system. So there's a guy in Britain doing home improvements, whatever, accidentally cuts his hand off. So he wraps a towel around the stump of his hand, the hand which, by the way, is now lying on the floor, and he calls for an ambulance. But due to cutbacks in the ambulance service, it takes an hour for the ambulance to get there, at which point he's almost bled to death. The paramedics immediately stop the bleeding, they stabilise him, so he's not going to die immediately. They take him to hospital where they stick him in the accident and emergency department waiting room, where he waits 6 hours before a doctor actually sees him. He says, "Doctor, you've got to help me, I need my hand sewn back on." The doctor says, "Yep, I see the problem, don't worry about it, let me just check the next available surgery date." Unfortunately, because they only actually have 3 doctors working on the ward when they should have 6, and so they're all working 18-hour shifts, and 2 of the 3 available surgery units have been sold by the government to private medical firms, and the hospital no longer has the budget to rent them back, the next available surgery slot is 4.5 months from now. Obviously, that's going to be too late. Sorry about that, but hey, on the bright side, it didn't cost you anything to find out that you're going to be going through the rest of your life with only one hand. Meanwhile, in America, the exact same thing happens. Guy accidentally cuts his hand off. He calls an ambulance. The ambulance is there within 10 minutes, stops the bleeding, takes him to the nearest hospital, charges him $2,500 for the privilege of going to the hospital in an ambulance. I'm not making that up, by the way. That's actually a thing. Yes, I know, Europe. Try to contain your shock and horror. He's seen by a doctor within 5 minutes of arriving at the accident and emergency department, or the ER, I think they call it in America. Doctor says, yep, no problem, we'll get you into surgery in 2 hours. By the end of the day, he's as good as new. The hand's reattached, he's starting to get some functionality back in his fingers. It's basically almost as good as new. And then the doctor presents him with a $150,000 medical bill, but that's all right, he's got medical insurance. According to his insurance policy, he'll have to pay the first $20,000 himself, of course, but he can just about cover that if he sells his pension plan and liquidates all of his life savings. But hey, on the bright side, at least he's still got two hands. Even if he now can't afford to retire and he's looking at, well, basically having to work full-time at least until he's 85. So he phones up the medical insurance firm and they cite some obscure regulation, giving them an excuse to completely flat-out deny his claim. So now he has to sell his house, and he's got no pension, and he's on the streets. But at least he's got two hands. Now, call me a hopeless dreamer, but I can't help but feel that there should be a sort of happy median that exists somewhere between these two extremes. And you'd think, you know, with all that we've accomplished as a species, we'd be able to do it. The French, by the way, and I know I'll have to give the French shit because I'm English and that's my job. Don't worry, the French get it. They do the same. The French have an amazing healthcare system. I mean, the British healthcare system isn't bad. It's just understaffed and underfunded. And the French system, on the other hand, is kind of like what the British system would be if the government was prepared to hire enough staff and put enough money into it. We're never going to have something like the French system here in Britain, and you're never going to have anything like the French system in America either, but for different reasons. We'll never have it here in Britain because too much damage has been done to our health service over the course of the last 30 or 40 years by successive governments just gutting it and selling it off for profit. And you're never going to have anything even remotely like the French healthcare system in America for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, everybody likes to make a big song and dance about the evil pharmaceutical companies who are just making way too much money out of the current capitalist health system in America, and own way too many politicians for anything to ever change. And that's probably true, but I don't think it's the biggest reason why you're never going to have a universal healthcare system in America that even approximates what they have in France. I think the biggest reason is cultural. Because, make no mistake, universal healthcare is expensive. It's not expensive for the patient, at least not directly. I mean, you go to hospital or have any kind of medical treatment in France and it doesn't cost you anything. But make no mistake about it, a universal healthcare system is hideously expensive. Not directly for the patient, but very expensive for the government. And of course, the government doesn't just pull all of that money out of its arse, it has to come from somewhere, and it comes from your taxes. So you do end up paying for it, just not directly. And the thing is, when you look at the French healthcare system, even here in Britain, where we do have a socialist healthcare system, just not a very good one anymore, even we think that some of the things that the French healthcare system provides for are just a bit excessive. For example, if, let's say you're a working mother in France and you become pregnant, well, you get maternity leave, paid maternity leave. The employee pays you, but the employee then claims that back from the government. So, yeah, the government pays for it and it comes out of your taxes. But you're pregnant, you're on paid maternity leave, we have that here too, and then you have the baby. But then what the French government does is it gives you the option. Because if you want to go back to work, you can, and the French government will pay for a nanny to look after your baby for at least, I think, the first year of the child's life. All free of charge. On the other hand, if you don't want to go back to work, again, the choice is yours, and instead you'd rather look after the child yourself, this is also fine. And it's also paid for by the government. You get what is in effect extended maternity leave, and again, I think for at least the first year of the child's life. And this is all paid for by the government. Well, it's paid for by you through your taxes, but it's manageable because everybody's paying the taxes. but it's manageable. It doesn't cost you $150,000 to pay for it all yourself. It costs you $20,000 through your taxes. So the load is spread out. But the primary reason why this system can exist in France and it doesn't exist in Britain and it would never exist in America, it isn't because the French don't have pharmaceutical companies that would massively profit from a capitalist system. They do. It's that the French have the will to shoulder that economic burden in order to ensure that everybody's taken care of. The French have a national collective will to ensure that everybody gets the best possible treatment, not just the treatment that's available or the treatment that they can afford. So here in Britain, Eddie's getting the treatment that's available. It's just not very good, and you could argue that due to a certain possible instance of mistreatment, it's actually making him worse and reduces his chances of surviving this stomach cancer. But hey, on the bright side, it's not costing him anything to find out that he's probably going to die. If this had happened to him in America, well, I guarantee you he wouldn't have been in hospital for 5 going on 6 weeks, still waiting to be actually treated. He would have probably been in and out and done within a week, and back home, ready to be treated as an outpatient for chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Well, I say back home, he probably wouldn't have been back home. He'd be living with his parents because he would have had to sell his house in order to be able to pay for all of it. If Eddie had been French, on the other hand, well, he would not only have received the best possible medical treatment available, all completely free of charge, he would have been at home weeks ago, being treated as an outpatient with a nurse coming around to check up on him every day. All of this at government expense. The only downside, of course, is that he would be French. So, nothing's perfect. Don't worry, I'm fake laughing. Only the tears are real. Anyway, so that's the situation. He eventually went in for surgery, and then they didn't do the thing that they put him into surgery for. At this moment in time, I do not know why, but I cannot think of a single way that this can possibly be good news. As soon as I know more, I'll let you know. In the meantime, fingers crossed for Eddie. God knows he could use some good news for a change. And that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Shorter than usual, but hopefully you appreciate why. In the meantime, I at least hope all of you have had a good weekend. And as always, take care. And I'll catch you next time.